Welcome to the J&K Show. I'm your host, Kay. Today we have a really special guest. I'm super excited to welcome Batia to the program. Batia, how are you and welcome?
Thank you so much for having me. I feel really honored to be here and I'm so grateful for the invitation.
Yeah, no, the thanks certainly belongs to us. So, what's so interesting for us to bring you on is we really wanted to take an opportunity to unpack. There's so much narrative, if you will, in and around Israel and their relationship with the U.S., global politics, and you being such a preeminent voice on coverage and speaking up for those in and around this topic. I thought there was no better person to bring onto the show so that we can talk through this and unpack this, especially with the current times and so much happening today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Like I said, it's really an honor to be here to talk about this.
Yeah. So why don't we jump right into it? I guess I'll frame the first question is a frame, and that is, how would you characterize kind of the general feeling about, from a U.S. perspective, citizens, how are folks feeling about Israel, and what really is in your opinion, the tone as we are today?
I think they're feeling bad about Israel. I don't think that the relationship between America and Israel is at the best place that it's ever been. Israel just fought a war. It was a defensive war. Hamas brutalized Israel on October 7th. They mass raped, mass murdered, took, babies and elderly people hostage, sexually abused little girls in captivity. I mean, just heinous, heinous stuff. And Israel had to fight this defensive war against Hamas. Unfortunately, Hamas exists within a civilian population. And so the images that came out of that war were really devastating and heartbreaking. This was called a genocide by the left, which of course it wasn't. Genocide is something much, much more extreme and much, much worse. Israel did its best to minimize civilian casualties. And at the end of the day, for every civilian that was killed, you had a terrorist. The ratio of terrorists to civilians who were killed was the best ratio that's ever been in urban warfare. So the way that this was presented was in a much more negative light than what actually happened. But the American people are a very good-hearted people. They saw those images coming out of Gaza, and sympathy for Israel is very low right now. I don't think that's so terrible. Israel is an ally. It's our greatest ally in the Middle East, although now, thankfully, we have other allies there. In general, our interests as Americans are pretty aligned with Israel's interests. They're not the same, but they're very much aligned. I will say on the far left now, you have this very anti-Israel sentiment where they think Israel does not have a right to exist. On the right, you have something else. What you have is a lot of young people who feel like they've been locked out of the American dream. They feel like they will never become homeowners. They feel like they don't have good jobs available to us. And they see a lot of our money as taxpayers going to foreign countries, whether it's the Ukraine or whether it's Israel. And they say, why are we sending billions of dollars to other countries when we can't afford to buy a home? Now, I think that's a totally reasonable thing to think. It happens to be that when it comes to Israel, we get a lot of bang for our buck. That $3.4 billion that they get is actually spent here in America. So they have to buy their weapons from us, meaning the money goes back into the American economy. They make those weapons better and then for free share that information with Lockheed Martin or whoever they've bought the weapons from. They share intelligence with us and they kill our enemies for us when they can.
Right.
But if we as, if Israel and if we as people in the media, if pro-Israel voices have not made that case clearly enough to young people, they don't owe it to Israel to give it the benefit of the doubt. So I think right now we're in a moment where people are feeling more suspicious of Israel. They're saying, well, show me the money. Are you really such a great ally? But I think that that will be proven down the road. It just might take a while to get there. But that said, on the left specifically, you now have a huge, very virulently anti-Israel sentiment that has nothing to do with foreign aid. has to do with the fact that on the left, they don't believe in nation states. They don't believe in nationalism. They're not very patriotic about America either. And they think Israel is a colonial project that is oppressing Palestinians. Of course, Jews don't see it that way. They say that we are indigenous to the land of Israel. There's 2,000 years of Jewish history there. You can't colonize a land that you were living on 2,000 years ago. And they won it fair and square in a war that was initiated by the Arabs in 1948. They were willing to share it, and the Arabs said no, so they went to war and the Israelis won. So they see it very differently, but the left, and this is increasingly true of the whole Democratic Party, has really turned against Israel fundamentally, not just on the aid front, but just they think that the Jewish state has no right to exist. And that is language that you're going to increasingly see from progressives and even from mainstream Democrats now.
Yeah, so it's interesting because oftentimes when you hear proponents speak about it, there appears to be this demarcation line, if you will, between Israel government, Israel country, and sometimes those get blended. Is there a way of speaking about one and supporting one side or the other, or are they by nature just combined together and it's just one total sum?
Of course, you can criticize a country and its government. Um, People who criticize Trump could be criticizing Trump from a very pro-America point of view, from a patriotic point of view. Happens to be a lot of people who don't like Trump also don't really like America. But obviously, you could criticize a government and still say, obviously, I love America. I just don't like this version of the government. So people could say, look, I support Israel's right to exist. I just don't like the Benjamin Netanyahu government, right?
Right.
I know some Palestinians who live in the West Bank, which is under Israeli occupation. And they say to me, look, Israel came at my expense. Before there was an Israel, we lived in Jaffa, we had a view of the ocean, and now I'm stuck living in the West Bank and I don't have the right to vote for this government of Israel. I'm not a Zionist. And of course, that's reasonable. Like, why should a Palestinian who's living in the West Bank under occupation be a Zionist? That makes no sense, right?
Sure.
But for a person who lives in America, who has no connection to the land, who says, I'm an anti-Zionist. I think Israel has no right to exist. I think the Jews who live there should either go somewhere else or should live under a Muslim rule, under Sharia law, right? That is going to make a lot of Jews feel like this person wants those 8 million Jews to live a much worse life than they currently do, to be in danger, to not be sovereign. And that's when people start to get touchy about it and feel offended. It's one thing to say, look, I hate the way Israel waged that war. Or Israel should not have waged that war at all. They should have found another way to protect themselves from Hamas. It's another thing to say Israel should not exist, because then what happens to the 8 million Jews who live there? Would you say that about any other country? That's when Jewish people, even Jewish people who don't live in Israel, start to feel a little bit like you really want bad things to happen to Jews. And then that makes them feel like that version of anti-Zionism is probably veering on anti-Semitism. I'll say one more thing, which is there was this narrative that came out when Trump went to war with Iran. This was Israel's war. Benjamin Netanyahu forced him to do it. He was puppeteering him, holding the puppet strings. Like, this is just obvious nonsense. Trump is not a person who you can force to do anything, including things that are in his interest. The idea that in the relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of a client state of the United States, and Donald Trump, that it is Netanyahu who has the power, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, right? It's so silly and stupid. Trump has been promising to do this for 40 years. The idea that he was forced to do this. So why would they say that? Why would people be convinced of a thing that is so patently ridiculous? How could they possibly believe this insane thing? So then you start to think, well, okay, there must be something else going on here. And so for a lot of Jewish people, the only thing that could justify believing something so stupid is that this person kind of has like views that Jews are uniquely sinister and powerful and have the ability to get behind the screens and secretly maneuver and take control and undermine the interests of the United States, right? Like, and that is the classic anti-Semitic stereotype that people have had of Jews for like millennia, right? So that, I mean, obviously it's not anti-Semitic to be wrong. It's not anti-Semitic to say wrongly Benjamin Netanyahu forced Trump to do this. It's just that it's so stupid. One wonders how could someone possibly be that wrong? And it's like, well, maybe they have this weird view that Jews are uniquely powerful, and that's kind of how people feel about it, I think.
Sure. We sometimes live in a bubble, in this kind of echo chamber. Are the opinions that we see here in the U.S. shared on internationally when it comes to Israel, or are we just kind of in this continuous loop, being here in the West, in the U.S. and hearing it? Is that also shared internationally?
I actually think America is way more pro-Israel than the international community is. So
Okay.
the majority of Americans are still pretty pro-Israel, even if they're feeling bad about Israel right now, like they would rather the Jews control the Christian holy sites than the Muslims, who would probably not take as good care of them. Most people in America, I think, sided with, certainly the vast majority sided with Israel over Hamas in the war and wanted Israel to win. Americans remain very pro-Jewish and pretty pro-Israel as well. The rest of the world has really turned on Israel and has gotten very anti-Semitic. And that
Interesting.
is a big difference. So, for example, in Canada, in London, in France, in Spain, you had millions and millions of people marching with the Palestinian flag and chanting from the river to the sea, which is a genocidal call against Jews. You didn't have that here. You had, the maximum I saw was there was one march that had, 10,000 people. That's the most they could get. You would never have millions of people marching against Israel in America because it's just not, it's still, I think, a pro-Israel and very pro-Jewish country. There's never been real anti-Semitism in America. And people misunderstand this. Liberal Jews misunderstand this. They think that the reason Jews were so involved with Dr. King and with the civil rights movement was because Jews felt like, oh, yeah, we're in this together. But the truth is the exact opposite. Jews felt very responsible for Black civil rights because they knew that they had always been treated as white in America. They'd always had white privilege here. And they felt they had to make sure that their Black neighbors got that too. That's why they were so invested in it. It's the exact opposite of what everybody thinks because America has always been a very pro-Jewish country from the founding. And that's a story we don't really tell. Which is what my next book is about, comes out in 2 days. But so I think that that's a real difference between America and Europe. In America, if you go full anti-Semite, you can't win elections anymore. And we just saw this in Texas with this crazy sex therapist who was running for Congress in Texas and she was going to put Zionists in internment camps and castrate them. And she lost by 30 points. And I think
Right.
with Thomas Massie as well, he just got obsessed with Israel, obsessed with AIPAC, obsessed with, the Jews are raising money to undermine America and kick me out of office. And I think that people in Kentucky kind of got the ick from that.
Right. So, what is the genesis of this? You started off by saying, hey, opinions, not so good. I feel like it hasn't always been that way, or certainly
Hmm.
not where it is now. You
Hmm.
talked about protests, tens of thousands. Now there are hundreds of thousands. We're seeing more and more protests on college campuses. What was the flashpoint? Why now? Why is this happening versus 5 years ago, 10 years ago? What's driving this?
It's a great question. A lot of it started after October 7th. So you had this moment where Israel was the clear victim of just heinous, brutal, graphic, horrific violence. Like what Hamas did on October 7th is like they shot nails into women's vaginas. They cut women's breasts off while they were alive. They mass raped them and then killed them and kept raping them while they were dead. I mean, I'm sorry to repeat all this, but I think it's really important that people know. And
I agree.
the day after this happened, leftists took to the street not to defend the Jews and Israel, but in defense of Hamas and the Palestinians. And Jews were like shocked by this because most Jews are Democrats. And so they expected when this horrible thing happened to their cousins in Israel that they would turn around and see all of their allies who they had marched with standing beside them. And they turned around and were shocked to see people marching in support of the Hamas, murderers. It was very, very shocking. And I think the reason that it happened is because the left is very caught in this mentality of they threw away this idea, this Judeo-Christian idea that like the whole of civilization is built on the difference between right and wrong, and we should try to do right by others and try not to be evil. And they said, no, there's only powerful versus powerless. There's only oppressor versus oppressed. And it's racial. So if you have white skin or lighter skin, you're oppressor and you are evil. And if
Right.
you have darker skin, you are oppressed and you are inherently virtuous and you have no moral responsibilities. And that includes Hamas. So because Hamas has less power than Israel, it got categorized as the oppressed and thus has no responsibility to behave morally. Everything they do is inherently virtuous because it's resistance to the oppressor, which is
Right.
Israel. And so in their minds, they couldn't help but justify this horrific violence because they saw the Jews in Israel as the supremacists, the whites, the oppressors. And that is just this mentality that goes so deep on the left. And it is so godless. It is so contrary to what this country was founded on and the beliefs that so many of us as Americans share that, about the ideas that this country struggled to live up to for a long time, but finally is kind of getting there. So I think that's really at the root of it is that if you think that there's no right versus wrong, there's only powerful versus powerless, and the powerless get to define what virtuous is and what correct is, you will always end up siding with terrorists if you think that they have less power than the people who they are terrorizing.
So who's benefiting from this? There's so I really feel like it has grown legs. Some of this, as we know, takes funding, it takes organization. And so when I start to look at this, I begin to say, well, who benefits from this? I can see based off of what protest and who's the subject of their opposition, but on the backside of it, who do you believe are the great benefiters, made up a word, of of this action?
It's such a great question. I think a lot of it, unfortunately, is the result of the education that very privileged white people get. So they go to university and they get taught this stuff. Like they get taught that there's oppressor versus oppressed and white people are bad. Well, what are you supposed to do if you're like a rich white kid and you're at Columbia University and you're, for example, the child of two movie stars who was arrested at one of these protests, right? What are you supposed to do? You're told in this milieu, like by all of the people who are cool on social media and on TikTok and everybody in your university and everybody that you admire and strive to be like is telling you, white people are evil and have no claim. You can never be good. You can never be right. You can never be virtuous. If you're privileged, if you have money, you're bad. What do you do? Because you want to be good. Well, what you do is you side with the oppressed, right? You get this, like, they have what I call oppression envy. They have envy of the people they consider to be oppressed because those people have this claim to moral authority. I mean, as humans, we naturally want to feel like we are moral, like we're good, like we're making a difference, like we matter. And the only way you can do that if you're in this privileged environment in America is by siding with the oppressed, which in this case, as we said, was like literal terrorists. They're trying to like have, it's like, virtue by proxy. Oh, I will cede all of my power to you, and I'll be on the side of like the downtrodden, on the side of the little guy, who in this case happens to be like the terrorist. So I do think a lot of that is not being funded, except for the fact that we fund our universities and they teach this crap, and I think that's terrible. Like a lot of our university teachers are like just they're straight up like Marxists. Like they will say this stuff in university classes. I've been in those classes, and they are completely on the side of terrorism. So a lot of it, I think, comes from that and is very like, it's not even being funded so much. We do know that there are some people who are like live in China and fund a lot of, like Code Pink. And they obviously, the Chinese Communist Party, Russia, Iran, all of our enemies benefit very much from chaos in America, from us turning on each other as Americans. So I think there's definitely that piece of it as well.
Well, do you see, speaking in you're in the media space, And so, do you see these? Recently, we had Tucker Carlson had interviews where he interviewed Ambassador Huckabee.
Mhm.
He interviewed Senator Cruz. There's Candace Owens that also have this, what I would describe as an anti-Israel kind of position. Do you kind of correlate what they're doing and the messaging that they're putting out, kind of similar to the same thing, the messaging, if you will, that you're also seeing that, like what you described, that on campuses?
I think it's a little different. I think that they just have straight up decided that if you scratch the surface of any problem, you'll find Jews. That's what I hear when I listen to Tucker Carlson now. Like at the root of every problem is some Jew, which is obviously just straight up
Mhm.
anti-Semitism, like classical anti-Semitism. So when he had Nick Fuentes on, for example, who's like a virulent racist, anti-black, anti-Semitic, like they agreed on more than they disagreed on. You know, Fuentes said like, every Jew is problematic, and Tucker Carlson was like, no, it depends on whether they support Israel or not, or whether they're, because they could convert. That was what Tucker Carlson said. Like, well, they're not all bad because they could convert to Christianity, right? Like that's literally classical anti-Semitism, right? Like Nick Fuentes was saying they're bad because of their race, and Tucker was saying they're bad because of their religion and their politics, right? Like they're both anti-Semites. I think Candace Owens as well. She just really does not like the Jews, and if you look at want to understand why that is, so with the students, I think it has to do with the psychology of like wanting to be good, even though they are very privileged. With Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, I think it has a lot to do with look at who's watching their content. And this is something Megyn Kelly said 2 weeks ago. She said Tucker Carlson is now getting most of his new viewers are Muslims. They're not from America. They are from, I mean, there's 2 billion Muslims in the world, and they are desperate for anti Semitic, anti Israel content. And if you can produce that very highly in America, you're going to have a huge global audience for that. I said this about Candace Owens about 2 years ago. I said, I don't think that Americans are consuming this stuff because what she's saying is very, Americans do not like racism against Jews, against black. Like they don't like to feel like they're consuming racist content. And I wrote that in an article. I said she's turned totally anti-Semitic because her audience is no longer domestic. And she threatened to sue me for writing that, not because I called her an anti-Semite. She didn't mind that, but because I said her audience is global, is not American. It's a bunch of Muslims who want to, and I turned out to be right about that. So I think it's a little bit different for them. It's more about audience capture. You know this because you're a content creator, but the YouTube algorithm is like has an insatiable appetite for anti-Israel content. It's very, very anti-Israel. If you post something that's anti-Israel, you will see your views go up by leaps and bounds. And if you post something pro-Israel, often you'll get hugely penalized by it, a lot of downvotes and so forth. So the algorithms are simply set up that way. And to your question, again, your very good question from earlier, who benefits from that? Again, I think it is our adversaries. It's funny because America was not pro-Israel from its founding. So in 1948, when Israel was founded, Harry Truman did recognize Israel, but America did not fund Israel. We didn't send weapons. It was the Russians who sent weapons. When did America decide Israel was a great ally and we're going to have this special relationship? That only really started during the Cold War in the 60s, in 1967, when Israel proved it was a great military force. And then Nixon, who was a complete and unrepentant anti Semite, he was the one who said, we need to give Israel so much money that the Russians will realize that this is our spot now, and we're going to use it to fight Russia because the Russians had sided with the Arabs. So Russia had come up with this narrative that Zionism is racism. And they came up with that narrative for one reason alone, which was the Cold War was between them and America, and the Arabs were siding with Russia. So they had to be against Israel. Not because they care about Israel or Jews, but because they were fighting America. So America said, oh, you're going to use the Arabs against us? We're going to use Israel against you. And Nixon said, you know what? Let's give Israel $2 billion. Until then, they had been giving them $300 million. Let's give them $2 billion. That'll stop the Russians in their tracks. Like the whole idea that the Israel lobby controls American politics, it's the exact opposite. America saw Israel and continues to see Israel as an ally in a global conflict against our other adversaries. China hates Israel. So We're in a fight with China, right? It's so we Israel is America our as Americans, it's our tool in a region where we have a lot of enemies. It's not the other way around. You get what I'm saying? It's like that we're reading the direction in the exact wrong way.
Yeah, I love that little bit of history lesson because I'm aware of that. And you're right. Uh, we're prisoners of the moment.
Yeah.
And so folks need to really certainly do some history, check their history and understand the origin of how we are where we are today.
Can I
Listen,
ask you something?
yes, please.
How did you get interested in this topic? Like, where do your views come from? Because they're very unique.
Wow. Well, I would start by saying I don't know if they're necessarily unique. I'm a part of certainly different think tanks and groups where we
Mhm.
talk about these issues,
Uh-huh.
and so for us, it's being very intentional about not just listening to what we hear, but
Mhm.
going in, turning the pages,
Mhm.
understanding, right? And sometimes that requires sitting with ideas, with people with ideas that are different from your own and listening to folks. And even if you walk away saying that's total nonsense, that's not
Mhm.
true, you have to go through the exercise.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
strongly encourage everyone to find out things on your own, like really
Mhm.
understand, read, become a student of a
Mhm.
topic that you're going to speak to, become much more aware. And I think from any place that starts from a position of disliking another group solely because they are another group is a
Mhm.
non-starter for me. And
Totally.
so, and it should be for many others. Especially you talk about race, especially as someone who is African American, right?
Mhm.
And this country's original sin. I'm
Mhm.
flabbergasted that other folks, other African Americans, can take a position to where they would have this kind of anti-Israel rhetoric or support or anything. It just seems
Mhm.
odd to me,
Mhm.
knowing our own history, that we would then
Mhm.
project that on someone else. So I appreciate you asking me that and give me an opportunity to talk through that. But to me, it seems so natural, like a natural thing to do, to find out, to seek information, to understand, hey, why is this? Is this true? This seems different. And you mentioned the algorithm. uh, we end up, because of that, on our feeds end up in this loop, and it's just
Mhm.
feeding you the same information. There's no dissenting thoughts or anything commentary coming from the other side, so we become robotic in this way of thinking and only thinking one way. I think it's up to us to be responsible to seek out information from all sides and to draw your own conclusion. And for me, this is how I landed here, so thank you for that. Appreciate
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
I want to give you an opportunity. It's kind of my last question. Your book. You're working on a book, releasing a book. Would love to hear about it and work with you in terms of promoting this with our viewers, listeners. Please tell us about it.
Thank you so much. It's called The Jews and the Left, and it's about why Jews became Democrats in the first place, and then why the left turned on them. So everything we've been talking about here, and I go through the history. I mean, the book starts in 1654 when Jews first arrived here, but like I said, people really misread our history because they were treated as white from the minute they got here. And a lot of Jews, if you say to them, look, Jews are white, you'll have a fight on your hands. But from America's point of view, from the founding fathers, we were treated as freedmen from the beginning. And I think that that is a big part of why, for many Jews, the civil rights movement was so core to how they viewed their Judaism. And there's a chapter in the book about a whole host of rabbis who were in the South during the Jim Crow era. And they gave these long interviews to this rabbi, and they were embargoed for 25 years, and they only came out a few years ago. And they're really beautiful about just how these rabbis who were embedded in the white Christian segregationist community were trying very hard to work with their Christian neighbors, their white neighbors, to change their minds about these things without creating resistance. So they knew that when the marchers would come from the north, this would make the white segregationist racists even more racist. It would make them double down. And these rabbis were trying to lead by example, and all of the Jews that they knew in their communities were completely against segregation. And they were trying to find ways to slowly integrate their the communities that they lived in. And there's just so many beautiful stories about why the Jewish store owners would do better because they allowed Black people to try on clothing, which a lot of the white store owners would not. And then the white store owners would get annoyed because they were getting all of this business. And it just like a beautiful part of our history. Holocaust survivors who survived the Holocaust and then moved to the South and were just completely horrified because they were like, we were the Blacks in Germany. And
Sure.
they sent us to camps, and then they came here, and suddenly they're seeing other people being treated that way. And yeah, I learned so much writing about it. Jews became Democrats because these issues like the civil rights movement were extremely important to them. But we're in a really different moment right now, and it's a very different time. The left now doesn't really stand for civil rights anymore. They stand for a host of other really crazy issues like open borders and anti-Zionism, the trans issue. They've really left the whole idea of what made Jews Democrats in the first place behind. And so I'm trying to urge my fellow Jews to think a little more critically, kind of like you are, about where we are and what they believe. And yeah.
I love that. And now, is it electronic and paperback, or what format is your book in?
Yes. So it's I have the hardcover here. This is
Love
the
it.
book.
Love it. We've got the great. That is a screenshot if I've ever seen one. We're going to make sure we have that. Absolutely.
But it's also on Audible. You can listen to it. I read it, and it's also on Kindle.
Awesome. Absolutely love this. Fatsa, I cannot thank you enough for
Okay,
joining
thank
us on the
you.
J and K show. Incredibly riveting interview. Although it felt more like a conversation, which I absolutely certainly love.
Yeah.
I apologize for bringing down the overall IQ. You were brilliant.
Oh, no, 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 no. First of all, I so enjoyed this. I'm so honored by this conversation. I will come back anytime you want me to, and we can keep the conversation going. And Kay, let me just say, God bless you and protect you and everybody that you love. And thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you. And likewise, folks, thank you for joining the J and K show. We appreciate you, and we'll be back again real soon. Bye bye.
Thanks for watching the J and K Show.